right, great. So we are recording. Welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I run the Forest Connect program, which includes this monthly webinar series. If I could have, some of you have already done this, but if I could have the rest of you type in your county and state where you're seated today. And so we have Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, West Virginia, Kentucky. I'll read these off. Connecticut. For Sandy, I don't think you can see these, Sandy. No. Lots of New York, a couple of Connecticut, Massachusetts, Missouri, PA, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Maryland, Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, Tennessee. So kind of mid-Atlantic hardwood region, as you might guess. So that's your geography. Well, it's 12 o'clock, so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Andrew Liebold. Sandy is with the U.S. Forest Service in Morgantown, West Virginia, and I don't know how long Sandy's been doing this, but I remember reading his research papers for a very long time. So he is an expert in the study of gypsy moth and more broadly with entomology. Andy was actually one of our first webinar speakers. We started this webinar series about 10 years ago, and I think within the first year I had you on, and you may have given a couple different presentations back then. But yeah, Sandy's back, and we are here to learn about gypsy moth, a persistent invasive insect pest. So, Sandy, I'm going to mute my microphone, and the cyber airwaves are all yours. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much, Peter. I'm really happy to do this. This is, I think, a great opportunity for reaching a lot of different people around the country. So, and I actually do love talking about the gypsy moth. That I've spent most of my career working with this insect, and when I started my career, there are a lot of us in the Forest Service that were working with it, and now there aren't many. So we're down to down to just a few of us, but it's a problem, as the title of this presentation suggests. It's a problem that basically just doesn't go away, and I'll be saying a little more about that. So, and again, Peter, chime in if there's any sort of audio or video troubles, and we'll work on that. So the gypsy moth is really a great example of a much larger problem, and that's the problem of biological invasions. The native range of the gypsy moth covers most of Europe, temperate Europe and Asia, and parts of North Africa. So North America, it's a non-native species, and we think that the gypsy moth invaded around 1869, and if you look at the larger problem of biological invasions of forest insects in the United States, it's about the time that sort of a switch went on, and it probably sort of corresponds with the Industrial Revolution and sort of the beginning of globalization, and that's when insects such as the gypsy moth began to enter and establish, since then we've been accumulating many more species. We think we have probably around 400 non-native forest insects in the United States. So one of the things that's interesting about the gypsy moth that maybe differentiates it from some of these other damaging non-native forest insects is that a lot of these species, if you go in their native range, they're not really a problem at all. The gypsy moth, on the other hand, through much of its range in Europe and Asia, it actually is a damaging insect. There are records of outbreaks all through Asia, Europe, and North Africa. So it's kind of unique in that way. And another sort of interesting thing that's unusual about the gypsy moth is that we pretty much know exactly where and how it established in North America. When we look at the biological invasion process, the whole phenomenon, we usually consider these three stages of the arrival, establishment, and spread process. And for the gypsy moth, we know that exactly where it arrived originally and that's was in Medford, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, and we know exactly who was responsible for it, and it was this man, um, Etienne Leopold Trouvelot. He was an immigrant from France, and he had his profession was actually he was a commercial artist, but he had an amateur interest in insects, and at that time, you know, I actually know people like this. Basically they like to play with insects, and he had sorts of insects that he had in captivity in his backyard. In Medford, and he was apparently, we don't know the details of exactly, but apparently he went back for a visit back to his native France and brought some gypsy moth egg masses and was rearing them in his backyard, and they got loose. And Trouvelot actually, this is a photo of his house and it's 27 Myrtle Street in Medford. And Trouvelot actually realized this could potentially be a big problem because he knew that in France the gypsy moth is a problem. And so he notified some local authorities about this escape, but nobody really thought it was, you know, potentially, no one really recognized the potential for damage. And so it wasn't for another 12 years, somewhere around 1880, that the first outbreak started in his neighborhood on Myrtle Street. You can see all the houses look the same on his street. I've been back to that house, the street, and they still look kind of the same. And around 1880, the first outbreak started on his immediate neighbor on Myrtle Street, and over the course of the next 10 years, that outbreak spread through his neighborhood in Medford into a larger area. And somewhere around 1990, the local Massachusetts authorities recognized that this is a problem that they should try to do something about. And so they attempted to eradicate it. That is to totally eliminate the species. And this is something, eradication is something that we still try to do with a lot of insects. And actually, there's been a lot of success in eradicating recent insect incursions in various parts of the world, including the US. But in this case, the attempted eradication that basically went on from 1890 to 1900 was ultimately unsuccessful. And a lot of that was because the tools that were available for finding gypsy moth infestations and for killing them were rather crude. You can see that they had crews of people going up into trees looking for egg masses and scraping the egg masses off. And ultimately, it was a noble effort, but it just didn't work. And so by 1900, the eradication efforts they gave up, and the gypsy moth was established in a roughly 3-county region around Boston in eastern Massachusetts. So since then, the gypsy moth continues to be in the spread phase, very slowly expanding its range, and we attribute the slow rate of spread in part to the fact that the female gypsy moths are unable to fly that we have in the European strain that we have in North America, and so the rate of spread has been quite low. And all through the history of gypsy moth in North America, there have been attempts to monitor the spread of this insect, and also some attempts to stop its spread. There was actually a noble effort that went on for various time periods from the early, from around 1920 through around 1960, where they attempted to have a barrier zone. Initially, it was around the Hudson River Valley, and then as that gave way, they made another barrier zone farther west. And even in the early time periods, they knew that the gypsy moth females released a pheromone, and that the pheromone attracted males, and that could be used as a powerful tool for attracting and detecting where newly invaded gypsy moth populations. So this is actually a photo of a trap that was used in 1900, where they actually had a gypsy moth female in a cage in the center, and then they had sticky panels around that to trap males, and this was used in one of the earlier barrier zone projects. And a lot of these efforts, they sort of kicked into high gear following World War II because of two major technological developments. One was the sort of the sort of maturation of modern aviation, and then the invention of the discovery of DDT, and basically someone discovered you could spray DDT out of an airplane, and so this was an idea that they thought could revolutionize, and there were even hopes that they could eventually totally eradicate gypsy moth again, and so there are massive applications of DDT in the northeastern U.S. where they sprayed millions of acres, and eventually there's actually eventually these activities were not so popular with a lot of residents, and part of the environmental movement in the US can be attributed to this massive application of DDT against gypsy moth. In fact, if you any of you have read Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring, there's actually a whole chapter that's devoted to aerial spraying of DDT against gypsy moth. And so eventually DDT was banned, and these massive efforts to stop the spread of gypsy moth in the eastern part of the U.S. in the early late 50s and early 60s, where they abandoned that. And since then, the gypsy moth has continued to spread throughout the eastern U.S. and Canada. And you can see this is about where the population front is, and you can see the orange areas are indicative of where we think the susceptible forests are, and we estimate that the gypsy moth still has only reached maybe a third of the susceptible forests where it's likely to cause damage. So there are still large areas that remain to be invaded and probably will be invaded in the future. There still is a lot of interest in monitoring gypsy moth spread, and in fact, the use of pheromone traps is something that has played a key role in that. That you remember the photo of the ancient gypsy moth pheromone trap I showed earlier, and this green little box is the typical trap that's used for monitoring gypsy moth populations along the expanding population front now, when they're baited with a chemical version, the synthetic version of the chemical attractant, and they're very, very sensitive for detecting gypsy moth. And these traps, if there's a reproducing gypsy moth population area, they almost never fail to find it. So it's a very powerful technique, and we've actually learned a lot about the spread of the gypsy moth by deploying these grids of pheromone traps along the invasion front. And one of the things we've discovered is that the invading population front doesn't really look like a continuous front, but instead we have this phenomenon where populations sort of jump forward and they form these isolated populations, which then grow and coalesce, and probably are responsible for a faster rate of spread than if we had a more gradual invasion front. And the way that we think that these jumps of populations ahead of the gypsy moth population front happen is because there's an unfortunate aspect of the behavior of gypsy moth larvae that they like to seek what we call cryptic resting locations. And these are places where they ultimately pupate and where the females ultimately mate and lay eggs. And unfortunately, a lot of these cryptic resting sites are on things like automobiles and lawn furniture, things that people move around. And we believe that this is how gypsy moth is often transported very long distances, and they form these isolated populations. So since 1999, there's actually been a project called the Gypsy Moth Slow the Spread Project. It's really designed to capitalize on this phenomenon of these satellite populations forming. And it basically, the way the program works is there's a 100-kilometer band of pheromone traps that's deployed all the way from, it's actually now all the way from Minnesota to coastal North Carolina. And along that band, traps are deployed to locate these isolated populations. And the idea is if these populations are found in the early stages, they can be found and eradicated, and this greatly reduces the rate of spread of the gypsy moth. The idea here is to reduce its spread, the rate of spread. Not, we know that it's probably impossible to stop the rate of spread, but by reducing the rate of spread, it allows forests in these currently uninfested areas to remain uninfested for a longer period of time. And so this is actually a map that shows the where traps are deployed in the United States. And most of the red ones that you see here along the advancing front, those are the ones that are deployed as part of the Gypsy Moth Slow Spread program, the STS program. But in the rest of the rest of these, what we call the uninfested states, there's a similar program. That's the STS program I should have mentioned is actually a program that's the lead organization is the U.S. Forest Service. In the uninfested part of the U.S., the lead organization is the USDA APHIS, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And basically in each of these programs, there's about 100,000 traps put out every year. And the strategy is very similar in the uninfested part of the states when populations they use essentially a grid of traps to detect newly invaded populations. And when typically the way it works is in one year there's an initial detection that goes on. In the subsequent year, more traps are put in to confirm that this is a reproducing population and also to delimit the population. And then in the third year, the population is treated. In the APHIS detection and eradication programs in the uninfested states, most of those treatments are done with the bacterial pesticide Bacillus thuringiensis, we call BT. But in the Gypsy Moth Slow the Spread program, the STS program, most of the treatments are done using mating disruption, which BT does have some non-target effects on other insects. Mating disruption only affects low-density gypsy moth populations, and this is a method that usually uses the pheromones are impregnated in these plastic flakes, which are sprayed out of the airplane with a sticky material, and the flakes emit a pheromone that confuses the ability of males to find females, and populations ultimately go extinct because of this. And the program, the STS program, has been quite successful. It actually was preceded by a program in the Appalachian region called the AIPM program. So when we look at basically before this program was started, that we had a spread rate of around 21 kilometers per year. But once the program has been in place, it's been successful in reducing spread rates by more than 50%. And again, it doesn't mean that we're eliminating the gypsy moth problem, but it means that in many areas they're going to be able to experience a longer period before gypsy moth kicks in. This is one of the things about gypsy moth which maybe differentiates it from some other invasive pests, like things like emerald ash borer, where the invasion happens, it destroys all of its hosts, and then the problem is over. With gypsy moth, once populations established, you have this sort of persistent problem that ultimately doesn't go away. I was going to say a little bit now about the basic biology of the insect. That the gypsy moth females, as I mentioned before, the strains of the gypsy moth in Asia, most of those populations, the females are capable of flight. In North America, we have a European strain, and those females are incapable of flight. And so they usually will lay their eggs in a single mass very near to the location where they pupated on, which is usually on the trunk of trees or under the branches of the trees, but occasionally they'll lay eggs on objects on the ground. And those eggs eventually they spend the winter. So the oviposition, I should say, the female egg laying typically happens in July in most parts of the northeastern U.S., and then they'll spend the rest of the summer in the egg stage, and then spend the winter in the egg stage. And then in the spring, around this time, maybe or into May, depending on where you are, the eggs will hatch from a mass. They're usually several hundred eggs in each egg mass, and so you'll have several hundred first instar larvae that hatch from the eggs, and those little first instar larvae typically crawl up trees, and then they spin down on silk. And when they spin down on silk, they'll disperse a little bit in the wind, and then they'll search out foliage again and start feeding, and go through several instars. The gypsy moths have larvae in the United States have 5 to 6 larval instars. They just basically keep getting bigger and bigger. And of course, it's the late instars, the large larvae, that do most. They eat the most. They're the hungriest, and so they'll eat most of the foliage. And usually, again, they'll pupate in the same location where they were rested. I should have mentioned that the gypsy moth larvae, especially the late instars, they typically feed in the foliage during the night, and then they'll actually crawl down out of the canopy to seek these resting sites during the day. And it's these same resting sites where ultimately they'll pupate, and then that's, as I mentioned before, the females will emerge, mate, and lay eggs. So the larvae, it's the late instar larvae that do most of the feeding. And we consider gypsy moth a generalist, that it's a very, we call polyphagous insect. That is, that it can feed on many different species of foliage of many different species of trees. But in the eastern U.S., probably the primary hosts are oaks. Although in some areas I'll find aspen is the major host, but probably throughout most of the eastern U.S., the oaks are the primary hosts. And so we consider, when you look at all different tree species, we consider one group, which are these, what we call the preferred species. And these are the species that especially the early instars do really well on feeding on. And then there are also what we call the resistant species, things like beech and maple and sometimes cherry. And these are the species that usually the early instars, the very small larvae, can't feed on, but the late instars can. And so these species actually sometimes will get defoliated. And then finally, you have what we call the immune species. And these are species that even typically during an outbreak don't get defoliated or fed upon at all. And so during an outbreak, of course, you get, when you get lots of gypsy moth larvae, you get huge areas over which you get defoliation. And this is why this insect is a problem. And it's a really interesting thing about when you look at the time series of gypsy moth defoliation totals over time. This graph, it may be a little bit confusing, but the purple lines show total defoliation in the eastern United States since over time, and the yellow graph shows the same data but just on a logarithmic scale. And one of the things that, if you start staring at these graphs long enough, and we've noticed statistically, is that there's a dominant 10-year periodicity, that roughly every 10 years you get a major outbreak. And then when we've stared at these time series even longer, we notice that there's even what we call a subharmonic peak of every 5 years. In between the major outbreaks, you get these little minor peaks in the populations as well. And this is a really interesting thing, and a lot, but not all forest insects, even a lot of native forest insect, foliage feeding insects, exhibit this phenomenon of oscillating populations or periodic outbreaks. And it's a great subject for people like me to study, because it's one of these things where many people have devoted their lives to trying to understand what's driving gypsy moth population dynamics. And we don't really know for sure. We have a lot of theories, but we don't really know for sure what drives these oscillations in gypsy moth populations. That a lot of parasitoids, these are wasps and flies that lay eggs that hatch inside of gypsy moth caterpillars, were introduced from Asia or Europe. But we tend to think that those parasitoids probably play a relatively minor role in the population dynamics of gypsy moths. And instead, we tend to think that generalist predators, namely small mammals, especially small mammals, are a major source of mortality in gypsy moth populations, and pathogens also play a major role in the population dynamics. And when, in terms of these two major players, the pathogens, we think that they mainly play an important role during the high density phase of gypsy moth population dynamics, and very often they're responsible for populations crashing. When you have an outbreak population, eventually you get very large numbers of gypsy moth caterpillars dying from pathogens, and then in between outbreaks, we believe that predators, these small mammal predators, we know that they can consume a large number of gypsy moth larvae and pupae, and they seem to play a key role in sort of maintaining gypsy moths at sub-outbreak levels. And it's a really interesting thing because uh, we know that weather affects gypsy moth population dynamics, but like a lot of insect populations, the way that weather affects the population dynamics of this insect is quite complicated. Again, the small mammals we know are a major predator of gypsy moth larvae and pupae, and weather can directly affect the small mammal populations as they can directly affect gypsy moth populations. But we know that small mammal populations, their dynamics are actually, in many parts of the eastern US, are driven by mass seeding, by the production of seeds in trees, very often oaks. And so we have this very complex situation in which weather can affect mass seeding, it can affect small mammal populations, and it can directly affect gypsy moth populations. And we believe that this complex interactions are one of the reasons why we have these sort of erratic but slightly periodic fluctuations in gypsy moth populations. And as I mentioned before, the other major players are pathogens, insect pathogens. And historically, the main gypsy moth pathogen, and in fact, this is something that all through the world, there's a virus that affects gypsy moth populations. We call it a nucleopolyhedrosis virus. And this virus, typically, it's very strongly related to gypsy moth densities, that it usually only kicks in when gypsy moth populations reach very high densities. But then there's another pathogen, a fungal pathogen called Entomophaga maimaega. And this pathogen, it's not so strongly density related, and it seems to be present in nearly all gypsy moth populations we have in North America, and causes, in most years, it's actually causes more mortality than the virus does. And so in terms of the sort of oscillations I was mentioning before, these regular oscillations, our current theory, and again, it's just a theory, is that these oscillations are primarily driven by this density-dependent mortality caused by the gypsy moth virus, and that the fungus, again, it causes it's causing mortality not only in high-density populations but also in low-density populations, and it has a rather complex biology, as does the virus. That both the virus and the fungus that can persist for many years in the litter in the forest floor. But the fungus, in the case of the virus, gypsy moths typically encounter the virus by crawling on the forest floor in the spring and become infected, and that sets up a disease cycle. In the case of the fungus, some of these resting spores in the forest floor in the early spring, they germinate and they produce airborne spores, which then infect the larvae. And then the larvae, you'll have many generations of the fungus in a single year, where the larvae become infected from spores, they produce new spores, which then are airborne and infect more larvae, and then eventually produce more resting spores. So it's a very complex process, and we know that in contrast to the virus, the dynamics of the fungus is very much dependent on environmental conditions, specifically very dependent on rainfall. And so and in fact, it's an interesting thing that this gypsy moth fungus, Entomophaga maimaega, the only part of the world where it was known to exist prior to 1989 was Japan, and where Japan is one of the wettest parts of the temperate world, and there are large records of these epizootics of this gypsy moth fungus. And actually the fungus wasn't known to exist anywhere else in the world, and including in the United States prior to 1989. And in fact, it's a little bit of a mystery of how the fungus really got to North America. That there was an attempt to introduce the fungus in the early 1900s by some USDA scientists, but they never recovered the fungus in the early 1900s, and they felt that they had failed to introduce it. But then in 1989, the fungus was all of a sudden discovered to be causing large amounts of mortality in the southern New England area. And to this date, we don't really know whether the populations we have of this fungus were basically latent populations that were introduced in the early 1900s, or if there was actually a subsequent introduction that we just don't know about. But very quickly, the gypsy moth fungus spread throughout the eastern United States, and as I mentioned before, it became a dominant pathogen. And we like to think that it's had a big effect on the gypsy moth population dynamics. That the two biggest gypsy moth outbreaks we've ever had were in the early 1980s and again in the early 1990s. Since the early around 1990, when the fungus was all of a sudden discovered to be causing a lot of mortality, we haven't had any outbreaks of the same order of magnitude as we've seen in the early 80s and early 90s. Now, that's not to say that gypsy moth has gone away. That we continue, since then, we've continued to have these periodic outbreaks. And part of those oscillations probably are driven in part by the by the pathogen outbreaks, but also we think that the emergence of the entomophica, this fungal pathogen, had a big effect in reducing the amplitude of oscillations in the post-1989 period. And one of the interesting thing was that in those of you who are in the New England, southern New England area, you may have experienced a large drought that happened that's existed in southern New England in early summer of 2015 and early summer of 2016. And we think that that drought may have played a role in triggering a very large outbreak that's been developing in southern New England and eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey over the last 2 years. And a lot of southern New England hadn't actually experienced a major gypsy moth outbreak for 20 years or more. And now we seem to be perhaps related to this drought and the consequent failure of the fungal pathogen Entomophica maimaega to control populations. We've had a resurgent population. So the gypsy moth is back in this area, much to the demise of a lot of landowners. So I wanted to say a few words about gypsy moth and forests. Not all forests are defoliated by the gypsy moth. Even though we have typically, during outbreak years, we have massive outbreaks over large areas. A lot of those, some forests are more defoliated than others. And typically when we talk about variation among forests, we often refer to variation both in stand susceptibility and in terms of stand vulnerability. So stand susceptibility is how we describe the probability of a stand being defoliated during a regional outbreak. But stand vulnerability refers to the probability of damage, really, of trees dying as a result of that defoliation. So it's important to keep those two things separated, because they're really kind of two different processes. And in terms of stand susceptibility and this probability of defoliation, a lot of that has to do with the fraction of the stand that's comprised of the primary gypsy moth hosts. And in a lot of the eastern US, this means how much oak there is. And typically you'll see in stands during these regional outbreaks, you'll see large, massive defoliation of the primary gypsy moth hosts, and then the non-gypsy moth hosts aren't defoliated at all. And so in terms of predicting the amount of defoliation that you typically see in an individual stand, it's a very simple thing. It basically has to do with the amount of primary hosts, which in many forests in the eastern United States has to do with what fraction of the stand is comprised of oak. And so typically stands that are 0 to 20% oak or other gypsy moth primary hosts, it's very unlikely that you'll see substantial defoliation because the outbreaks really never get going in those kind of stands. And basically, the intensity of the defoliation is closely related to the amount of oaks in stands. And in fact, one of the things that during regional outbreaks of gypsy moths in the eastern United States, especially places like the Ridge and Valley domain of places like central Pennsylvania, is you see very intense defoliation along these ridges. And what that really is reflecting is very often the ridges of the Ridge and Valley very often have large components. The forest composition is dominated by oaks, and so that's where you see the defoliation. And the more as you get into areas where there's a higher composition of non-gypsy moth hosts, you tend to see fewer years of defoliation and less intense defoliation. And this is a pattern that's repeated everywhere where gypsy moth has become established. Following gypsy moth outbreaks, most trees usually, if you just have 1 year of defoliation, most trees usually recover. But we have had, it's not uncommon to observe this phenomenon of catastrophic tree mortality. Again, especially in these stands where there's a very high percentage of oaks where you may get repeated defoliations. Very often we do see some situations where you can get large proportions of the overstory dying. Again, this is more the exception rather than the rule. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to predict because it seems to be sort of a spotty thing that happens some years in some locations and not others. Certainly, one of the ways to one of the reasons why this happens in some areas and not others is simply the number of years of defoliation. If most trees can withstand 1 year of defoliation, but if you have 2 or 3 years of defoliation in a row, this is something that many trees just don't have the resources to tolerate, and they may start dying. But the other thing is that a lot of times these catastrophic tree mortality events are closely related to the occurrence of other things like drought, late frost, et cetera, which are additional sources of stress, and you have these cumulative effects that can result in tree mortality, large amounts of tree mortality. And of course, the other thing is that trees that are in poor condition prior to the outbreak, those are the trees that are most likely to die, which is not very surprising. And then, of course, other secondary agents are associated with tree mortality associated with gypsy moth. And in fact, it's usually not the case that a tree directly dies simply because of gypsy moth defoliation, but it's usually these two agents, the Armillaria mellia, the shoestring root rot, and the two-line chestnut borer, play a major role in gypsy moth-caused tree mortality. So for example, with two-line chestnut borer, it's a really interesting phenomenon. By the way, the two-line chestnut borer you may recognize as a close relative of the non-native emerald ash borer, but this is a native species that colonizes oaks in the eastern U.S. And following a major gypsy moth outbreak where you get large numbers of defoliated trees, the stress caused by the defoliation facilitates the ability of the two-line chestnut borer to colonize those trees and ultimately kill them. And you actually get a little outbreak of the two-line chestnut borer developing, and it can sometimes spread into reasonably healthy trees. So in terms of the overall impacts of gypsy moth, especially concerning like the economic impacts of gypsy moth, there definitely are reasons to be concerned about impacts on market values, on timber. But we generally tend to think that that's probably, from an economic standpoint, the impacts on timber are probably not the major impact of the gypsy moth. That the non-target impacts really are the main source of impacts of the gypsy moth, and some of those these non-market impacts are quite varied, and they include things like the way that forests are valued for watershed. That unfortunately there have been several instances where massive defoliation events, and that this causes increases in nitrogen leaching into streams and into lakes. You get algal blooms, which cause havoc for municipal water supplies. But probably the major impacts are sort of the visual impacts of gypsy moth on residents and people using forests for recreation. That defoliation, it's just, most people consider it not a pretty sight, and the gypsy moth also, just the large numbers of caterpillars. This is a picnic table shown here with large numbers of gypsy moth frass or excrement and dead caterpillars. And gypsy moth outbreaks are generally not fun. And this is especially true for homeowners, that during outbreaks, you have large numbers of caterpillars. Of course, they're defoliating trees, potentially damaging them. They're eliminating shade, and you have large numbers of caterpillars very often crawling into people's houses, and the caterpillars are hairy. And I can attest, I have 18 acres of land around my house, and that I experienced an outbreak, and it really was not fun. And so it's very understandable that people get very upset. Homeowners get very upset. And there's a certain characteristic, I think, just simply these hairy caterpillars that a lot of people find really scary. And so it's a sort of recurrent phenomenon I've seen over my career, is that when you see outbreaks in a region, large numbers of landowners and homeowners, they become very upset, and rightfully so. And when they become upset, they call people like their extension agent, or sometimes their politicians, local politicians, and they expect them to be doing something about this problem. And so all of this sort of public, and so the question is, well, what can you do about the problem? And this is where I bring up the topic of gypsy moth, we call suppression. When we talk about gypsy moth management, we really consider three types of management. And I've already spoken about how we manage the invasion process. That we have this slow the spread program, which is aimed at slowing the spread of the gypsy moth into the United States, as well as the detection and eradication of populations in uninfested portions of the US. And then in the area where the gypsy moth is established, though, we also do what's called suppression. And this refers to basically trying to prevent defoliation during gypsy moth outbreaks. And the U.S. Forest Service actually has a program we call the Cooperative Gypsy Moth Suppression Program. And the way it works is that the U.S. Forest Service basically subsidizes the cost of aerial spraying. The aerial spraying is mostly done with Bacillus thuringiensis, a bacterial pesticide, and some states participate in this program and some states don't. Most of the New England states may have participated in the past and have generally gotten out of the program. You generally see, especially states, the more newly invaded states are usually in the program. And in each state, the cooperative program, gypsy moth suppression program, it operates in a different way. Usually somewhere around 50% of the funding for the aerial spraying comes from the U.S. Forest Service. Depending what state you're in, the state government will chip in some money, the landowner pays money, and sometimes the county government also will chip in with money as well. And over, if you look at the acres sprayed for gypsy moth suppression as part of this co-op suppression program over the years, you can see the amount of aerial spraying, it tracks the amount of defoliation in the sort of boom and bust cycles of gypsy moth outbreaks. One of the things I should point out, well, one thing that you can see from this graph is that the material that's used for aerial spraying, if you go back into the 60s and 70s, most of the aerial spraying was done with chemical pesticides. And over time, almost all of the aerial spraying for gypsy moth suppression is now done using Bacillus thuringiensis, the bacterial pesticide BT, mainly because of concerns about the environmental impacts of chemical pesticides. Um, and the other thing I should point out about the co-op suppression program is that it's usually, even though this looks like a large area, we're treating millions of acres. If you compare that with the millions of acres that are defoliated, it's a relatively small fraction. Usually it's 10%, or it's well less than 10% of the defoliated area gets treated. And one of the things that's tricky about suppressing gypsy moth populations is simply predicting where the defoliation is going to occur. Obviously, there's no point in spraying a population that's already crashed. And so the method that we use, that's typically used for predicting defoliation, is based on the overwintering counts of egg masses in stands. And there's a statistical relationship shown here between the overwintering egg mass density and defoliation. And most states will use a threshold of something like maybe 200 or 500 egg masses per acre as a threshold for making a decision for sort of go, no go of whether to conduct aerial suppression. And we count, there's a rather standard protocol for quantifying overwintering gypsy moth densities. This involves the use of 40th acre circular plots in stands and visually counting all the egg mass populations during the winter. And suppression, as I mentioned before, it's a tricky business. I mean, part of the problem is that that there's a difficulty of predicting where the defoliation is going to occur and whether populations are going to crash. It's also tricky that BT is not an easy material to use. That it degrades quite quickly, and the gypsy moth life stages, it's usually typically only the early instars are susceptible to BT. The late instars aren't susceptible, and so if you spray too late in the year, it's not effective. And then it's also unfortunately affected by precipitation. If you apply BT and then you get a big rainstorm, it may wash all the BT off and it may become ineffective. But you can see from this aerial photo, you can see an area where there was an area sprayed along this road, and in many cases aerial spraying can be quite effective at reducing defoliation, at least in 1 year. Most studies show that suppression, it's usually only has an effect in 1 year, and either in the subsequent year the population may crash, or if it doesn't crash, the area may need to be treated again. So, but there has been definitely, despite the problems associated with suppression, it can definitely be effective in preventing defoliation. And finally, I wanted to just mention, in terms of as another option that is always available, or not always available, but in stands that are managed, there are silvicultural approaches that can be used to mitigate the gypsy moth problem. And one approach is basically the idea of reducing stand susceptibility by simply thinning stands to reduce the component of oaks. As I mentioned before, the probability of a stand being defoliated, the intensity of defoliation, is closely related to the amount of primary hosts. So if you reduce the oak density, you're less likely to have as many years of defoliation. The other thing that you can do is to reduce the vulnerability. That is, you can increase the probability that trees are going to withstand the defoliation. And this is done simply by thinning to remove low vigor trees. And then there's sort of a close related thing. And of course, if you're doing one of these reducing stand vulnerability, you really have to do this well in advance of defoliation. Whereas if the defoliation is already happening, or then it's really too late to reduce the vulnerability. And then probably your only other option is salvage. That is, after the outbreak is run its course, it's possible to recover some of the volume in dead and dying trees following the outbreak. And so I think, Peter, that's my last slide. And so I'd be happy to take questions. And if any of you don't have time to ask questions now, I can always send me an email at my email address. I love to talk to people about the Gypsy moth, even though not everybody loves the Gypsy moth. It's a really interesting problem, and I'm always interested to hear about what the situations are in different parts of the country and what problems people might have. So, Peter, do you want to relay some questions?
Sure. Yes, Sandy. And first of all, thank you. It was a great presentation. As I knew it would be, very thorough and informative. So let's see. Let me scroll backwards, make sure I'm getting to the start of the questions. So why do gypsy moths have a preference for oak?
Well, that's a really good question, and there's probably no simple answer. That most plant feeding insects have some sort of preference for some species over one plant species over another, and we tend to think that insects and plants, they have a long evolutionary history, and sort of you can almost think of it as a battle, that plants have evolved chemicals in their foliage to prevent insects from feeding on them, and insects then evolve mechanisms for overcoming those chemicals that are put in the foliage. And it's a really interesting thing, because what you find is that different groups of plants, say oaks versus maples versus cherries, they use different chemicals to ward off insects feeding on them. And so certain insects have, through evolution, have specialized on overcoming the toxins and other materials that are put in the plant foliage that they feed on. And so in the case of the gypsy moth, we can only speculate, but it seems that they have evolved to specialize in tolerating the nasty things that oaks put in their foliage. And again, gypsy moth is native to most of temperate Europe and Asia, in much, but not all of the range of the gypsy moth, but in a very large portion, maybe most of the range, their native range, they're feeding on oaks. So there's a long association between oaks and gypsy moths, and that probably goes back, way into evolutionary history, and is why they have this specialty.
Is the pattern, does the look of the forest affected by gypsy moth in Europe or Asia look similar to the look of a forest similarly affected in the U.S.? Or does the insect pretty much behave the same way?
Well, it's hard to say. I think probably the short answer is no, they don't behave the same way. And a lot of this is, essentially every forest is different, right?
Right.
And I must say, it's amazing. I remember a few years ago, I saw a gypsy moth outbreak in a cork oak stand. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen cork oak. And I've always wondered, like, the gypsy moth has this, strange behavior where the larvae seek out resting sites for hiding during the day. And I always thought, why do they try to do that? But once I finally saw gypsy moths hiding in cork oak, it all made sense, because cork oak have these like little caves in their bark, and so I can see it's probably a really clever escape mechanism that maybe doesn't work quite as well here.
Yeah.
But in terms of sort of the overall relationships between gypsy moth and forest in Europe and Asia versus North America, I think it's safe to say that the impacts of gypsy moth in North America tend to be a little worse than in Europe and Asia.
Mm.
That I've never seen massive numbers of trees dying as a result of gypsy moth outbreaks in Europe and Asia as I've seen in in North America. And part of that may not only have to do with the nature of the forest, but also the natural enemies. Even though there have been attempts to introduce a lot of the parasites and predators that exist in Europe and Asia. There's some species that are still not established, of species that are common in Europe and Asia that we don't have here, and those species probably help keep gypsy moth populations a little bit more in check. But a little bit of it is a mystery. But some of the parasitoids that we don't have here, the reason we don't have them is because they need other species of insects to. They may go through a generation in 1 year on gypsy moth, and then go through another generation on another caterpillar species. And unless we wanted to introduce those other caterpillar species, which I don't think we want to do, then we probably can never establish these other parasitoid species. So that might have something else to do with why gypsy moth populations are probably at least a little more damaging in North America.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you anticipate any effects of climate change on gypsy moth, aside from the host population and the insect itself, the response to climate change?
Yeah, gee, that's a tough question. It's an interesting one too. I mean, we only have we generally think. I mean, this is an area where a lot of us as scientists, it's a really interesting problem that we're still trying to figure out. But we generally think that there are direct climatic limitations on gypsy moths, that we know very cold temperatures in the winter are adverse for the survival of gypsy moth egg masses. And so in parts of, say, there are parts of Maine and Quebec and Ontario where gypsy moth has become established, but it never goes into outbreaks, even though they're hosts, not only oaks, but aspen actually is a great host, gypsy moth host, but they don't seem to ever have outbreaks. And we think that's mainly because so many of them, the egg masses, get killed in the winter by cold temperatures. And so obviously with warmer winter temperatures, that would probably be a good thing for gypsy moth on the northern extent of its range. And so we could potentially see a northward shift in the range of where we see gypsy moth outbreaks. Conversely, you could see, we tend to think, we're beginning to think that there may be, and this is kind of a new thing, we're beginning to think that there may be climatic limitations in the southern range of the gypsy moth that limit the populations. That, for example, in the coastal plain of Virginia, the gypsy moth has never really taken off, even though there's some really good gypsy moth hosts there. And we're beginning to think that that's maybe simply because the summer temperatures are so high that they actually have adverse effects on gypsy moth survival. So you could see both a northward shift in the range of outbreaks, new areas where we could have outbreaks, but you could also have warm temperatures impinging on the potential area for outbreaks in the southern range of the gypsy moth as well. And then, of course, the effects of climate change on trees is another thing that we know, that drought is when you have gypsy moth outbreaks coinciding with droughts. As I mentioned before, drought seems to have an adverse effect on this fungal pathogen. So increased amounts of drought could possibly cause more intense gypsy moth outbreaks. And then also drought is also associated with tree mortality following gypsy moth outbreaks. So if there was, increased levels of drought could have adverse effects in both ways, both in terms of outbreak intensity and tree mortality. So, but it's still, it's something we're just speculating on. It's a little more difficult to speculate on than things like hemlock woolly adelgid, where we have a more clear picture association of climate limiting the spread of the species.
Sure. How does the entomophagia fungus infect the larvae? So that maybe the mechanism, how does it get into it? Is there, I
Yeah,
don't know if the question is about vectors or just maybe, do you know a little bit about that
yeah,
relationship?
yeah. It's a really interesting thing, which is different. In fact, I mentioned there are the two gypsy moth pathogens. There's this virus, and we know the virus particles can only infect gypsy moths when they eat the virus. So that means that the virus has to get on the foliage or onto the mouth parts of the gypsy moths. But the fungus actually, it primarily it infects gypsy moths via these airborne spores. We call them conidia, and they literally, the spores settle from the air and they land on gypsy moths, and the spores germinate, and the fungus grows right through the integument, through the skin of the insect, and that's how infection happens. So the virus, they eat it, the fungus, it just grows right into the body of the insect.
Well,
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
You kind of hinted at this. What's the primary host tree in Asia and North Africa for the?
Well, it's actually really interesting. I mean, again, lots of Europe and Asia oaks are the primary hosts. Like, so for example, through most of Europe and even North Africa, the main hosts are oaks. Um, and even in Asia, or at least parts of Asia, I've seen in gypsy moth in Japan, usually the primary hosts are oaks. But I've been in other parts of the world. So one bizarre part of the world that we normally don't think about gypsy moth is Central Asia. So the stands, things like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, there the primary hosts are native stands of pistachio and native stands of apple and walnut. Um, in other parts of the world, for example, in Mongolia, uh, we've seen massive outbreaks of gypsy moth on larch,
Huh.
which is another interesting thing that, again, it's a kind of a bizarre thing, but the deciduous conifers, so larch, um, taxodium, which is, I guess, bald cypress, and metasequoia, which is a dawn redwood.
Right.
They're all, most conifers are not good gypsy moth hosts. Some of them are completely immune. Some are in the sort of intermediate category where they can get defoliated by late instars. But the deciduous conifers um, are actually turn out to all be really good hosts for gypsy moth. Um, but so far in North America, the range of gypsy moth hasn't really gotten to any areas where we have a lot of uh, of deciduous conifers. But I can tell you, when I had a gypsy moth outbreak in my backyard, I have a dawn redwood, and I had lots of larvae on it. They loved it.
Yeah. What does the suppression program do to pollinators?
Well, that's a good question. I think probably it's safe to say that there probably is not much of a reason to anticipate much impact on pollinators. That, as I mentioned before, in the 60s and 70s, these suppression programs were mostly using chemical pesticides, things like carbaryl, and those things definitely are known to have adverse effects on bees. And really, that was one of the reasons why in suppression there's very little usage anymore of chemical pesticides. And so now the reliance on Bt is, one of the reasons is to avoid impacts, because Bt, the strain of Bt that's used for in suppression programs, it only affects Lepidoptera, so other moths and butterflies. And so the impacts on bees should be, we really shouldn't expect to see any impacts at all. Now, there still are, that doesn't mean that, we're totally home free, because there are still some of these, what we call non-target impacts on other Lepidoptera. And in some cases, there may be Lepidoptera of concern. especially endangered butterflies and other Lepidoptera. And in those areas, people definitely would normally want to avoid using BT. There are actually, there's another material that's actually used in some of those cases, which is actually, it's called GYPSF, which is actually a formulation of the Gypsy Moth virus that's actually aerially sprayed. And the Gypsy Moth virus, it only affects Gypsy Moth, and so it doesn't have any of these non-target effects on other Lepidoptera. So it's really great in that respect. The problem is that the main problem is that it's there's very limited availability, and it's very expensive because the BT is relatively easy to manufacture. They manufacture it in these huge tanks, or they basically grow it in cell culture. But the only way that you can produce the Gypsy Moth virus is by mass producing gypsy moths in a laboratory, and then infecting them, and then harvesting the virus. And as a consequence, there's very limited amount of this material available, and it's very expensive. So usually in most years there's sort of a competition that the Forest Service usually pays to produce about, I think it's about 20,000 acres worth of gypsum, and there, that material is divvied up among the states to only the most areas where there's the most concern about use of BT. But BT, in terms of bees, there's probably not much concern for effects.
All right. Early on, you mentioned that there used to be many people studying Gypsy Moth, and now there's very few. So somebody wants to know, why are there fewer Gypsy Moth experts now than in the past?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, and part of this, unfortunately, it has to do with, the reality is that there's declining budgets, that there's even this year it's looking really bad for budgets. But even if you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been declining federal and state funding of research on forest insects. And the other part of the problem is that we have more and more problems to deal with. That quite frankly, we get a new major forest insect invasive species turning up every few years. And so a lot of in the good old days, there were a lot of us could just devote all of our time to gypsy moth, because we didn't have things like emerald ash borer, we didn't have Asian longhorn beetle, we didn't have so much of a hemlock woolly adelgid problem. But now there are fewer of us, and our attention is spread thinner on more topics. So, and the other part of I should also mention, is because we haven't seen the outbreaks that we saw in the early 1980s and the early 1990s. Since then, we haven't had as massive of gypsy moth outbreaks as we've seen before, and so that's probably one of the reasons why there's been less attention given to gypsy moth as well. So it's sort of a perfect storm of a lot of reasons. It's a funny thing, because I'm one of the only few people that work on gypsy moth as in the Forest Service anymore, that when people retire, they send me all their old reprints, and my office is like stacked with all this stuff. And I sort of feel myself like maybe I'm some relic from the past. But, oh well.
So I think you've pretty much hit on this, but the question is whether gypsy moth spread is going to slow or even stop as it goes south. Thinking about some of the oaks on the coastal zone in the Piedmont of North Carolina, maybe won't taste as good, or environmental conditions won't be as conducive to spread. So you'd mentioned that earlier, kind of a southern limit relative to a northern limit.
Yeah, but it is a bit of a mystery, I have to say. Like I mentioned before, we've been sort of surprised that the coastal plain of Virginia and North Carolina, we had, I have to admit, like maybe 20 or 30 years ago, we had anticipated that that area was going to blow up, because there are a lot of hosts. There are a lot of oaks. There's also a lot of sweet gum, which is a really good gypsy moth host. But the populations have never really blown up in those areas. And part of the reason, I mean, I'd like to give some of the credit for that to the Slow the Spread program, which actually has been pretty effective at keeping it out of the area. But I think there may be also climatic limitations in those areas too. The Appalachian, in terms of sort of like where future damage is going to occur, I think there's no doubt as the gypsy moth spreads down through the Appalachians into, you know, the mountains of North Carolina, Georgia, those kind of places, gypsy moth will be a huge problem in those areas. And because, you know, those areas are cooler, we also know they have a lot of primary hosts. I mean, it is an area where, again, where the Gypsy Moth Slow the Spread program has definitely bought a lot of time for those areas, and hopefully we'll be able to postpone the date that those areas get invaded in the future too. The other area, another area where is a little bit of an unknown, is some of the lake states, that parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota. We know that there's a lot of susceptible forest types in those areas, but we're still a little unsure. Maybe some of those areas are climatically too cold for gypsy moths. We don't really know, and again, time will tell. And then, of course, I always refer to the Ozarks, or sort of the promised land for the gypsy moth, because, you know, when you look at maps of where the hosts are, the Ozarks are really like ground zero. It's a really a lot of oaks in the Ozarks, and so again, hopefully we can postpone the date that the gypsy moth invades the Ozarks. But when it gets to the Ozarks, I think that will be it will do really well. And of course, if you look at the United States in general, I tend to think that there are a lot of forests in the coastal region of the United States where gypsy moths will probably be a pretty big problem. Certainly places, coastal California is in many respects very similar to the Mediterranean areas of Europe, and I can imagine gypsy moths will be a chronic problem there someday, in the oak forests there.
Sure. Okay, so here's a question that could probably be a webinar unto itself, or maybe a series of webinars. I don't know if you'll be able to do a full answer. And then there was a website that was given as a backup for the question. But the question is, can you do a side-by-side comparison of gypsy moth caterpillar to other defoliating caterpillars? Is that something you can cover in a question, or is that there's one of the other participants gave a link to a comparison, a government document online.
Well,
so do you want to defer to that, or how do you?
Well, I'll take a look at it, but it's, I mean, I probably don't have time to look at the website,
no,
but,
right.
But it sounds like it's actually quite an interesting point, because it is true that gypsy moth is just one of a much larger category of very similar insects that of other foliage feeding insects. And we do actually have some other invasive foliage feeding insects that are big problems, and maybe very similar to this. So, for example, the winter moth, which is another very prolificous moth species, and it's invaded in the United States. It's invaded some of the southern New England, eastern Massachusetts, and it's caused quite a bit of havoc. And it's a little bit scary to think about what it's going to do, as if it does continue to expand its range, it could cause a lot of damage. And so the winter moth is another example of a damaging foliage-feeding forest insect that's invasive. We've had, around the same time of when the gypsy moth invaded in the late 1800s, there was another closely related insect, the brown-tail moth, that was invading about the same part of the New England, and actually it fed on many of the same oak hosts and whatnot, and was a very comparable problem. But it was largely successfully controlled via biological control, via the introduction of parasitoids. I'm sure referring to the brown-tail moth, and the brown-tail moth is largely not a problem at all, except in a few places, mostly in beach plum along marine coastal areas. But in terms of sort of the comparison with other types of forest insect problems, in many ways, the gypsy moth is very different from a lot of the problems we have, say, for example, with bark and wood-boring insects, things like the emerald ash borer. And one of the things I think which is really, if you compare, say, emerald ash borer and gypsy moth, one of the things that's a spectacularly different aspect is that, as I was mentioning before, the emerald ash borer, it invades an area and it kills large numbers of its host trees. But we're thinking that once emerald ash borer kills all of its host trees, it'll probably eliminate most of the hosts, and the problem will mostly, go away. Sort of like chestnut blight was sort of a similar thing. When chestnut blight spread through eastern North America, it killed all of its hosts, and then we didn't really notice it. Whereas gypsy moth is very different because it doesn't usually eliminate its host. And even though you can get tree mortality, that's the exception rather than the rule. So when gypsy moth invades an area, you basically get the problem, and then the problem is just a recurring problem. It just goes on forever. And so that's sort of a difference. Um, um, maybe another difference is that, say, a lot of, as I mentioned before, emerald ash borer and a lot of other non-native insect invasions, if you go to their native range, they're not a problem at all. And this may have to do with the coevolution of a lot of these insects with their host trees. The emerald ash borer and its native hosts in Asia, the native hosts have evolved defenses so that the only trees that in its native range in Asia that it can colonize are stressed trees that are dead and dying. But because North American trees don't have any previous evolutionary contact with the emerald ash borer, they the emerald ash borer can kill most of these hosts. But gypsy moth, in contrast, even though and I think maybe what's the big difference is that in its native range, like I mentioned before, in its native range, it, it's an outbreak insect. And so it's the problem in the gypsy moth in North America, we can't really attribute that problem at all probably to being a problem of lack of evolved host resistance, because even the hosts in its native range are not resistant. There may be a bit of a difference in terms of, like, as I was mentioning before, we think that some of the natural enemies that gypsy moth has in Europe, we don't have established here. And so that may explain one of the reasons why the outbreaks are perhaps worse here. But in many ways, the gypsy moth situation we have here resembles Europe. And so that differs from a lot of these other forest insects where they are not problems in their native range. So I'm thinking other. I can't think. Maybe, hopefully, those are. I guess
that's a lot of.
Yeah, those are probably
off the cuff. You did a lot with that question, I'd say. Yeah. So well, that's tremendous.
Interesting question. So yeah, I'll probably think of some other things.
Yeah, that make I think a very interesting some future webinar.
Yeah,
and that's the questions that I get as extension forester. Probably half of them deal with forest health kinds of questions. So that's always a popular topic. So there, and I'll just let you know, there are lots of people that are saying, great webinar, awesome job. I'm not reading down through those. I'm just so you know, you've people have very much enjoyed this. The last question I have is, has anyone studied the effects of forest fire smoke on gypsy moth, specifically prescribed burns in capital M9 for insect control? So FM9, is that a Forest Service region maybe, or?
There's region 9. I don't know what FM9 is.
FM9. So maybe if Carlene is still on. Well, so fuel model.
Oh yeah, okay, No, it's an interesting thing. I mean, because to be honest, I've never really thought of it. And in fact, even though there's certainly probably a lot of places in where gypsy moth is a problem, where fire probably doesn't play a big role. On the other hand, there probably are a lot of places, in fact many places, that are sort of chronic gypsy moth area regions where places like the Pine Barrens of New Jersey or Long Island or Cape Cod and all those regions, I think fire, historically played a major role in forest dynamics. So it's a really interesting question of, could fire be used as a tool for managing gypsy moth? I don't know. I mean, I guess uh, whether the smoke would potentially have an adverse effect on say egg masses, I don't know. It's possible. Certainly, we know, for example, that in most populations, you get a certain number of egg masses that are laid on things like logs, lying on grounds and on the ground, and presumably, if you had a ground fire, that some of those might get killed, which would be a good thing. I mean, the other thing that occurred to me is it's possible that um, fire in those kind of forest habitats, fire probably plays a significant role in kind of determining forest composition. And again, I'm not really an expert on this, but maybe again, gypsy moth is kind of a chronic problem in a lot of these oak pine stands, and maybe the use of controlled burns could promote a higher component of pines, which would probably make a lot of those stands more resistant to gypsy moth outbreaks than having a higher oak component. So no, that's an interesting idea. So I'll have to think about that. I appreciate that suggestion.
Okay. All right. Let's see. So I guess so the question was specifically about smoke inhalation killing other insects like bees.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about
So
that.
something to put on your to-do list. So
Yeah, I know there are cases of there are some bark and wood boring insects that as I understand, are actually attracted to smoke, and so that they, this is sort of an evolutionary thing, because they're probably responding to
future stress trees.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're when there are fires, you have
Right.
very often a lot of stressed trees. And so
Great. There's great interest. There's great anticipation among the the
yeah,
wood-boring
yes. So
insects.
some of
So
those insects are actually attracted to smoke, which is kind of a cool thing. But
yeah.
I don't know about how smoke would affect, say, larvae feeding in a canopy. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I don't.
Interesting question.
I don't have enough experience with fires to
Yeah,
add anything.
sounds like fun, actually.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Sandy, thank you. We've exhausted all the questions. You've done a fabulous job. I want to thank you and all the participants. I think we had a high of just over 100 people on the noon session.
Great.
And we'll see you back here tonight. Same, you can click the same link you did. And if you want to connect about 10 till 7, then I'll be on before that, and I'll do a sound check with the audience. But if you want to, join in at quarter till or 10 till,
Yep.
and we'll go with this again. So
great. Well, it's really been fun, and I really appreciate
great.
it.
Well, it's a great job. You're a wealth of information, and this is
Okay.
a super webinar. So thank you all, and see you soon.
Okay, Peter. Talk to you later.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.